much. So I'll be talking today about 4 points mainly, for the sake of time, because I noticed that's only half an hour that I have. I thought I had more. So I'll be talking about the present status, the threats and risks to heritage worldwide, and the development of this particular field, the cycle of the disaster risk management before, during, and after disasters, and the way forward, how we can conclude to put things into practice. Those who don't know ICCROM, where I belong, is an international organization, intergovernmental organization with 136 member states, and we, of course, the UK is one of the founding member states of ICCROM, and we serve the whole world in areas related to conservation and management of cultural heritage. And we have, as Justin just mentioned, we have an office in Sharjah covering the Arab world, where risks are becoming so high due mainly to conflicts. At ICCROM, as an international organization, we try to direct all our prospective work in line with the Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. And I would like to focus on the lower part here on sustainable cities and communities, where we try to also address issues related to risk management and disaster management. And you see on the lower line, you have issues related to climate and effects of climate change, how heritage can be a major player for justice and peace, and how we can develop partnerships with other sectors in this particular area. So if I start with part 1 on threats and risks to cultural heritage, as you all know, the incident in Notre Dame has been well covered in the media. I'm sure you all have followed that. Lately also, the museum in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, where we were also asked to give some advice and consultation, where 20 million objects were damaged because of fire. And other examples, we can look from China, Xinjiang, where you have also effects of fire, and, I'm going back, sorry. And also earthquakes, where this one is from central Mexico in 2017 that affected important historic buildings in the country. Also, from the Philippines, effects of earthquakes. This is from Bohol Island in 2013. So, I think if we, and there are many other examples, but I just chose a few just to show you how it is important that this field is in need to be addressed. And that's why ICCROM had made it as one of the priority strategic directions that we will be developing in the next 6 years. This survey shows a number of World Heritage sites exposed to geological hazards by region, and that actually indicates to you, at least in the case of earthquakes, how, and also tsunamis and also floods, etc., how much there is a need to address these issues, such as these floods that occurred in Thailand in 2011. And you see the monuments are swimming, in amidst the floods. And also, if you will look at the flood risk to the World Heritage cities in the world, you could see how much these cities are prone to flooding, because most of them are either on rivers or on coastal lines. This is an example where you could have different types of risks at the same time in Zanzibar, in Tanzania, where you could have different areas affected by floods, either by the sea or other earthquake and many other risks. If we look at this graph of the UN ICCR, you could see how the floods, the storms, and the droughts and the extreme temperatures are affecting affecting actually historic monuments in particular around the world. So this is actually also a very good indication. And a research done at UNESCO in 2012 illustrates that around 60 World Heritage sites have not, which were actually part of what is called a periodic reporting exercise for different regions of the world, did not identify the risks of these properties. So this is just a sample of World Heritage, and what about the other types of heritage that are not on the list? From the Arab region, we have conflicts as intentional destruction and collateral effects. These examples, I'm sure you also followed in the media, from Palmyra in Syria, in Sana'a in Yemen, and we have also followed the effects of destruction in Iraq a few years, a decade ago, as well as more recently in Syria and the Umayyad mosque, for example, in Aleppo, and many other monuments in Yemen and Iraq. And in Egypt, during the riots, also the museums were not exempt from such damage and destruction and theft and looting. One could also look at how many countries experienced that type of destruction and intentional destruction, and how they recovered their cultural heritage. An example from Mostar in Bosnia, and we'll be talking about that as well in the context of reconstruction and recovery. And of course, you probably all followed the Aslan case and the reconstruction and the dilemma of how we could look into these examples and cases where we could learn from them and plan better for the future. So this is just to highlight the importance of this field, and I'd like now to move into how this field has developed in the past years, 3 decades or so. And these publications from ICCROM actually indicate to you, since Sir Bernard Fielden, who was the first, the third actually, director of ICCROM, wrote in '87 this book on disasters, focusing on earthquakes, and then we developed risk management manuals, and then we moved into more recently into managing disaster risks. So this field moved from what we used to call preventive conservation from late of 1959 till more recently, talking about all measures and actions aimed at avoiding and minimizing future deterioration and loss. Examples how we could do that, for example, in museums, in the sense of how we register objects, how we catalog, store, handle, secure, how we train, how we raise awareness, and how we look at legal compliance. We moved from that, let's say, a turn of the century, of the 20th century, into what is more risk-based approach to preventive conservation, and how we could reduce risks to cultural heritage, and we have been working with various international partners in this field. So all these guides were actually giving some kind of information as to how we could prevent destruction and how we could address threats. But these did not address how we could prioritize and define the priorities in the course of planning our actions. So we looked from other fields and developed an approach from the health and business fields in particular to see how we could address the risks and risk prevention. Examples, for example, this is from Egypt, from the museums, from a monument where salt has damaged these stone objects, and in a very, very short time. Similar to lighting within the museum, where this, for example, a pharaonic fan that lived for 1 million years or so and was destroyed within 5 years due to lighting and measures that were not put in place for prevention of such drastic effects. And of course, we talk about issues related to looting and uncontrolled destruction, especially in areas where there is no control, and specifically where I now manage the ICCROM office in the Arab region. Of course, issues related to development as well have been major major, this is an example from Lebanon, where many development projects have not addressed the conservation requirements of these historic sites. And this is actually an ongoing discussion that takes place always at the World Heritage Committee meeting, which is actually taking place now in Baku, in Azerbaijan. So we looked at these types of threats that you can see here on the screen, and we looked at more immediate drastic effects, as well as being natural on the upper side or human on the lower side. And we have looked at that and described how we deal with them. So the threats to heritage sites could be many, and I just tried to refer to the most important ones. But what I'm trying to say here is that we move from documenting and addressing threats to addressing their impact. So this is quite important in understanding what is our objective in the area of conservation. If we think about conservation is to retain significance and values of a historic place or a property or a building, then we have to see how we could manage the change, and we add also the word continuity to change, because we need to manage continuity. And conservation is practically embedded in this objective that I hope that we all believe in. So if we define risk as a chance of something happening that will have an impact on objectives, on our objective, you could see that we could highlight low risks and high risks, and in the middle we have intermediate risks. But the more important is to see how are the chances to happen for such risks, and what is the impact of each type of risk. And this is at the heart of the principles of risk management, which is actually also developed based on developing risks from other fields, as I mentioned, notably, for example, how we develop risks from climate and climate change aspects. So this approach considers all risks, not focusing on one more than the other, and how we could look at the slow as well as the cumulative to catastrophic risks. So if we think about this approach, we look at the various agents of deterioration or the source, and how the sites or the collections are affected through an interaction or an exposure, and there is a path that leads to that, and how this has an impact on the loss of value. And we could think about very different layers in this process, from a region to a site to a building to a room to a storage to an object in a museum, and we could think where is the first line of defense to avoid and prevent this risk to happen. And there were 10 agents that were developed in this disaster risk management. In fact, I have also a book that we published lately. For those who are interested, I have 3 copies with me, on a guide to risk management for cultural heritage, particularly focused on museums, as to how we could address these types of risks in a very methodological approach, which I don't have time to describe. But if you think about it for a building such as this temple in Japan, a wooden building, we could think about, there are 14,000 buildings of similar type in Japan, 4,000 top buildings of higher value, 10,000 important buildings, 4 fires in 11 years, and what is the risk of loss to fire? So this is a way how we develop the risk management process in the sense that we have to develop this methodology to monitor and review, establishing the context, identifying the risk, analyzing the risk, evaluating the risk, and then treating the risk and communicate all that to the others. And the approach allows to identify priorities of these agents that I just mentioned. So what are the priorities, where we should focus our resources and our work on? So this is just to give you an idea for this case. So this is how the field evolved. My third point is to look at the cycle of disaster risk management, which involves before, which is planning or prevention, during, which is response, and after, which is recovery. And if we look at this cycle, we could think about, as you see here in the middle, before the disaster, during the disaster, and after the disaster, but then we have different aspects related to risk assessment, prevention, mitigation, preparedness, and then emergency response, as well as after the disaster, how we assess the damage to treat and develop a recovery or rehabilitation plan. So each step will have different aspects, as you probably are familiar with, to look at how we could prepare, and of course planning is key, as you all know, and how we could look at how we recover a disaster after that it happens. So if we start with the prevention before, the key effective protection of cultural heritage at risk is advanced planning and preparation. And this advanced planning and documentation should be conceived in terms of the whole property, meaning like if we think about a city, it should be a city or a site, and provide an integrated approach for the building structures and their associated context and landscapes. And of course, documentation, inventory, and survey of properties are key principles as well. So analysis, of course, also the values that are in line with the physical aspects that we address, and the use of up-to-date documentation methods, and how we could look into traditional techniques and skills that exist in a place, as well as looking at disaster response history and how we could learn from the past occurrence and frequency of these threats, and developing conservation and recording that should be integrated in all these phases, starting from the planning phase. So these are just few examples to show you that how we could look into this by understanding a site, its vulnerability and its risks, and aims to of these surveys to assess the condition and better understand, in this case, changes to post-excavation. This is an archaeological site. So this is what is called the ABC method, which I just tried to explain to you, where it has 3 steps. One is risk identification, risk analysis, and evaluation. Of course, those who are interested can maybe look at our publication also on the website. So this, in essence, looks at estimating the magnitude of the risk, the frequency or the rate, the loss to each affected element, and the loss of value to all affected items. And this can look at the various different agents of deterioration which I mentioned, and then we have to look into so this all explained in this publication. And then, of course, you have condition assessment and mapping that I'm sure you all do, and using high technology nowadays, using Google Earth even to know more about conditions of sites or history options of certain sites. Then we move to the risk analysis, where we will be looking at analyzing how this can be rated, what are the activities that are causing these risks, and then we reach into the risk evaluation, looking at the various steps and evaluate our priorities that I just mentioned to see what kind of actions we can take in the long term. So this is before. Now during, which is the response, we have developed a field called First Aid to Cultural Heritage in Times of Crisis and Disasters, which is a framework of action inspired by the humanitarian assistance. And here we have looked, we look at situation analysis, initial damage, it's during the event, evacuation, salvage and stabilization, temporary storage and recovery, early recovery needs assessment. So what is First Aid to Cultural Heritage? It is a method, it's a combination of response procedures that include documentation, security, and rescuing and stabilizing until specialized help is available. And this is important to highlight in our plans how we could deal if an incident happened. These are pictures from Beirut, Lebanon, where actually these monuments were saved from destruction during after the Civil War. So this method of first aid looks into these 3 steps that I've just mentioned, but also looking at documentation as a continuing aspect, the risk management and communication and collaboration, because sometimes we as professionals, we talk to each other, but I think it's really important to see how we could work with other sectors, and more recently we have worked with civil defense and military and other people. I still have 5 minutes, okay, I will run a little bit. So this is just to give you an idea. We can look at complex emergencies where several risks are intertwined together, and we have to look at the reality of complex emergencies, humanitarian issues as well. These are pictures from Lebanon after the war. We can look at abandonment and neglect in the case of conflict, and these pictures are from Yemen, where we can look at the lives even of people. I talked also about looting, illicit trade, examples from Syria, mapping them, and how we could use drones and satellite technologies in this process to evaluate the effect of damage at many of these historic sites actually in the Middle East, from Aleppo. And how it is necessary to prepare the teams during team of first aiders, how they are working with all the other civil defense sectors, and how they could develop methodologically the evacuation and salvage of objects. And there is how they prioritize, how they stabilize, and how they decide. How they document, rapid documentation, when they don't have time for detailed survey, and how they evacuate in this case. This is an example from Lebanon where, when the war occurred, the protection of the objects in the basement of the National Museum of Beirut were actually encased with these concrete walls that were then opened after the war ended. So in first aid, we don't look only on the physical aspects, we also look at various issues that you could see here also on the screen, analyzing the conflict, understanding how we can communicate, and how we could look into legal issues as well. And more importantly is to look at the significant attributes that lead to the values inherent in every heritage place, and how we can retain and stabilize and document these places. Again, more on the technology that you're all familiar with, how we could utilize up-to-date technology, how we could develop these. We did that for Yemen to have a quick, rapid damage assessment, and the project of EMINA, which is funded by the British Fund, has helped also to develop with us an application to assess these damages using mobile technology. We were also at work in many countries during disasters and conflicts. You can see on the screen, lately in Kathmandu and also in many other areas around the globe. Evacuation, cataloging, etc. Finally, after the recovery, which is the recovery, these are pictures from early recovery in Myanmar, and how we learned from lessons now that things happened for better planning. Usually we have the plans ready. I mean, this graph actually looks at how the attention of the media is at its highest and the funds are available when the needs and the capacities are not in place, during the time of conflict. And when they become available, we have lost the funding and we have lost the attention of world assistance and help. These are also examples from Beirut, the importance of involving the communities in the recovery process. The reconstruction of Beirut was actually discussed a lot, and now the reconstruction and recovery has been an important topic discussed at the international level, how we can deal with principles of recovery and reconstruction. And how we could deal, when we say reconstruction, we talk about recovery of the lives of people as well. These are examples where people are still using their historic places in Syria, in the case of the church, and I mentioned Palmyra. So we conducted several meetings in this field at the Louvre, at ICCROM, focusing on documentation, and we developed basic principles at a conference that we had in Warsaw last year, and this is now published. Those who are interested in principles of reconstruction and recovery can look into this. And these actually highlight these aspects that you can see on the screen, ranging from integrated conservation to legal measures and conservation approaches and local participation, which is really at the heart of any recovery process. I want to conclude quickly by looking at a few slides. I will jump a few slides to highlight what is important for recovery, the necessity to enlarge reconstruction in a perspective that encompasses and integrates approaches with a shared vision with the various sectors, the necessity to build the institutional and legal capacity on the national levels, and the necessity to engage the local communities, I mentioned Beirut as example, and inhabitants as part of the recovery process, and the necessity to develop public and private partnerships carefully planned with the various types of institutions involved in this process. And also, as you know, when we have response and recovery, there is a transition phase and there is a breakdown of authority, and what we're trying to do here is to think about recovery at an earlier stage where we can think of an early recovery so we could have more resilient societies in place. And the last point is how we could respect the beliefs and ambitions of people. So local communities is at the heart of any successful recovery and risk reduction initiative. So you have various stakeholders, but I think without the local communities and their involvement, we cannot achieve such a conceptual framework. We have some examples of some successes. This is a project which we received funding from Britain for the recovery of community museums in Western Sudan, and we are continuing this project. It is such a very rewarding project because it highlights the importance of community involvement and appropriation of their heritage in the recovery of the museums, that they actually have objects of their own inside these museums. And just very last point, we have to think about risk management in the sense of how we could integrate it into the national institutional policies, but the national conservation policies to take the proper decisions. And we have to think about the legal aspects. We had several meetings looking into this and how we could strengthen that in legal provisions. And we have worked with other humanitarian workers, being it on the national level or the international level. On the international level, we have to work with other clusters of UN humanitarian aid structures. And I wanted to say that guidance and publications, I just mentioned one, we have produced some lately, are important to the future of this particular field, and I hope we will have collaboration also with Britain in this area. And so this is my 30 minutes according to my timer. So I just wanted to highlight the importance of publications and guidance, and I also wanted to highlight the fact that we as professionals have more responsibilities beyond our professional realms of specialization. We have to be more resourceful, more people-focused, and more action-oriented. And I think this is really important in any work related to risk management and recovery. Lately, with the World Bank, there is a project called CURE for city reconstruction that we are taking forward, as I mentioned, in projects like Sudan that I just mentioned. And nowadays we're involved in practical projects for the reconstruction of the city of Mosul, which was totally destroyed, and starting with this symbolic monument of the Al-Nouri Mosque in Mosul. And I think we need to look into how we connect DRM to long-term resilience by looking at reducing vulnerabilities, how we look into integrating heritage and disaster risk management, and utilizing heritage for building peace and resilience and enhanced cooperation between the various players in any disaster risk management work, and how we empower communities. And I have to mention we have some successful results when we did several trainings. Some people now have become leaders to promote these new or recent or up-to-date methods, if you want, in addressing their real-life situations in their countries. Lately we had Prince Charles visiting us to look at what we have been doing, actually, and he looked at how we salvage objects, for example, in case of disasters. And I end here by looking at a hopeful future for places such as these places in Syria, which were devastated lately, and we are trying to do our best to also move from our national responsibilities to also international help and relief. And I have to thank, actually, again, the United Kingdom for supporting some of our work at ICCROM. And I hope if you have any query after this presentation, please don't hesitate to contact us at any time to provide any of these documents that I've just mentioned during the presentation. So thank you very much for your attention, and sorry for running 3 minutes over time. Thank you.